The camp was on edge. The news of 6 soldiers vanishing into the forest spread like wildfire among the troops. No sound, no struggle, just gone, leaving behind nothing but claw marks on the dirt and a few shredded pieces of gear. The air was thick with unease, and every soldier's face reflected the same question. What could have taken them? Sergeant Steve Rogers stood near the campfire, gripping a torn piece of fabric stained with blood. His jaw clenched as he stared at the forest, its twisted trees looming like a wall of shadows. The whispers among the men grew louder, filled with fear and speculation. Some blamed wild animals. Others muttered about ghost stories they'd heard from the locals. But deep down, everyone knew this was something far worse. Steve turned to Lieutenant Jacob Mason, who was pacing nearby with his rifle slung over his shoulder. 6 men don't just vanish, Jacob. Not like this, Steve said, his voice low but firm. Jacob stopped, his eyes narrowing at the dark expanse beyond the camp. You think it's an ambush? British soldiers, maybe? Steve shook his head. This isn't their style. Whatever it is, it doesn't leave tracks. It leaves fear. The forest loomed just beyond the edge of the camp, its dense foliage seeming to absorb the faint light from the lanterns. The trees creaked in the wind, their skeletal branches reaching out like claws. The horses, usually calm and obedient, were restless, snorting and stamping their hooves as if sensing a predator nearby. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating, and the faint rustling of leaves in the distance felt like a whisper of doom. Steve stepped closer to the fire, its flickering light casting long shadows across his weathered face. He could feel the weight of his men's eyes on him, waiting for orders, for reassurance that everything would be okay. But he couldn't lie to them, not when he didn't believe it himself. We're going in, he finally said, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at his gut. Jacob, get a team ready. We're not leaving those men out there. Jacob hesitated. You sure about this? We don't know what we're walking into. That's why we have to go, Steve replied, gripping his rifle tightly. We can't let fear keep us from doing our job. Within minutes, a small group of soldiers gathered at the forest's edge, their faces pale but determined. Steve led the way, his lantern casting a weak glow that barely pierced the darkness. The air grew colder as they entered the woods, the sounds of the camp fading behind them. Every step felt heavier, as though the forest itself was trying to hold them back. The first sign of trouble came less than a quarter-mile in. Deep claw marks gouged into the bark of a tree, jagged and unnatural. Nearby, a patch of ground was torn up, the dirt disturbed as if something had been dragged away. One of the soldiers, a young man barely in his 20s, swallowed hard and whispered, "What kind of animal does that?" Steve didn't answer. He crouched down, examining the marks closely. They were too precise, too deliberate. This wasn't the work of a bear or a wolf. It was something else, something intelligent. The forest seemed to close in around them as they moved deeper. The trees were unnaturally still, their branches barely swaying despite the wind. Shadows danced in the corners of their vision, fleeting and impossible to track. The soldiers' breaths came quick and shallow, their grip tightening on their weapons. Then, faintly, a low growl echoed through the trees. Everyone froze. The sound was guttural and inhuman, vibrating through the air like a warning. Steve raised his hand, signaling for silence. The growl came again, closer this time. sending chills down their spines. One of the men muttered a prayer under his breath, his hands trembling as he clutched his rifle. "Stay close," Steve whispered, his voice barely audible, "and don't break formation." They pressed on, their boots crunching softly on the forest floor. The lantern's light flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. Steve's heart pounded in his chest as the growl faded into silence, replaced by an oppressive stillness. It was the kind of silence that made every sound, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves feel deafening. Then they found it. A clearing littered with torn clothing and broken gear. Blood stained the ground in dark, sticky pools, and a strange object lay among the debris. Jacob picked it up, a claw, long and curved, unlike anything he'd ever seen. "This isn't natural," Jacob said, his voice trembling. "Steve, we need to turn back." Steve didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the edge of the clearing, where the shadows seemed to shift and ripple. For a moment, he thought he saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at him, but when he blinked, they were gone. The growl returned, louder and closer than before. "Whatever's out there," Steve said quietly. "Whatever's out there," Steve said quietly. "It's watching us." The soldiers tightened their formation, their fear palpable. The growl grew into a snarl, and the shadows began to move. Steve raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. He knew they were out of time. Whatever had taken their men was coming for them next. The growl turned into a piercing shriek that echoed through the forest, making the soldiers flinch and instinctively aim their rifles in every direction. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard. Part animal, part something far worse. Steve motioned for the men to tighten their formation, his heart racing as he scanned the darkness ahead. The lantern in his hand shook slightly, casting flickering light on the trees, their bark scarred with claw marks. "Stay focused," Steve whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own heartbeat. "Don't fire unless you see something." The group crept forward, each step heavy with dread. The forest felt alive, the air thick with an almost tangible energy that seemed to press down on them. The shadows shifted again, darting between the trees with an unnatural speed. One of the younger soldiers, Private Allen, let out a shaky breath and whispered, "It's playing with us." Before anyone could respond, a branch snapped behind them. Everyone spun around, rifles raised, their lanterns sweeping through the darkness. The beam of light caught something, a fleeting glimpse of a figure, humanoid but impossibly tall, its eyes glowing like embers in the night. It disappeared in an instant, leaving behind only the faint rustle of leaves. "What the hell was that?" Jacob hissed, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Steve replied, gripping his rifle tightly. "But it's hunting us." The men pressed on, their breaths visible in the cold air. Every sound, the crunch of leaves, the creak of branches, felt amplified, as though the forest itself was alive and watching. Steve's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what they were dealing with. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't human. Whatever it was, it moved with purpose, circling them, toying with them. As they neared a small clearing, the group froze. In the center of the space lay a heap of bones, picked clean and scattered across the ground. Some were animal, but others were unmistakably human. Steve's stomach turned as he noticed a familiar insignia on a torn piece of fabric nearby, the badge of one of their missing soldiers. Jacob knelt down, his hands trembling as he picked up a skull, its surface marred with deep, jagged scratches. "This isn't just a predator," he said, his voice hollow. "It's something worse." The growl returned, deeper and more menacing, reverberating through the clearing. The men raised their rifles, their eyes darting between the trees. The glow of those fiery eyes appeared again, this time closer, watching them from the edge of the clearing. Steve's finger hovered over the trigger, but he hesitated. The creature didn't move, as though it was waiting for something. "Don't shoot," Steve ordered, his voice firm but quiet. Not yet. The tension was unbearable. The creature stood just beyond the reach of their lanterns, its outline barely visible. It was massive, its body shifting and rippling as though it were made of shadows and flesh. The eyes burned brighter, and then, in a blur of motion, it was gone. The men spun around, searching the darkness, but the creature had vanished. "Steve, we need to get out of here," Jacob said urgently. "We're sitting ducks out in the open." Steve nodded, his jaw set. "Fall back, slowly. Keep your eyes on the tree line." The group began to retreat, their movements careful and deliberate. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing tighter together, their branches clawing at the sky. The growl followed them, growing louder and more aggressive, but the creature remained hidden, stalking them from the shadows. As they reached the edge of the forest, the growl stopped. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying. The men paused, their breaths ragged, their eyes scanning the darkness. Steve turned to Jacob, his face grim. "We need answers. Whatever this thing is, it's not going to stop." Back at the camp, the soldiers gathered around the fire, their faces pale and their hands shaking. The story of what they had seen spread quickly, and fear took hold of the entire camp. Steve sat near the fire, his mind racing. He couldn't let this thing continue its hunt. He had to find a way to stop it. Later that night, as the men tried to get some rest, an elder from a nearby Native American tribe arrived at the camp. His face was lined with age, and his eyes held a wisdom that seemed to pierce through the fear hanging in the air. He approached Steve, who stood to greet him, his rifle still slung over his shoulder. "You have awakened something," the elder said, his voice low and steady. "Something old, something vengeful." Steve frowned, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" The elder gestured toward the forest. "The land remembers. The blood spilled in your battles has awakened it. You call it a monster, but it is more than that. It is a guardian of these lands drawn to war and violence, and it will not stop until it has taken what it is owed." The word sent a chill down Steve's spine. "What does it want?" The elder's eyes darkened. "It feeds on chaos and fear. You cannot kill it with your weapons. It is bound to the land as old as the trees and the stones. If you wish to survive, you must understand what it truly is and what it truly wants." Steve stared at the elder, his mind racing. The creature wasn't just hunting them. It was something far worse, something they couldn't fight with bullets or blades, and it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed its due. The elder's words echoed in Steve's mind as he stared into the fire, its flickering flames doing little to ease the cold dread creeping into his chest. Around him, the camp was restless. Soldiers whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously toward the forest. Even Jacob, who had always been the skeptic, sat silently, gripping his rifle as if it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The elder sat across from Steve, his weathered hands resting on his knees. His presence was unnerving, yet there was a calmness about him that demanded attention. "You have seen it, haven't you?" the elder asked, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, almost as if he already knew the answer. Steve nodded slowly. "We saw something. It's fast, intelligent, and it's hunting us." The elder's expression didn't change. "It is the Skinwalker," he said plainly, "an ancient guardian tied to the violence of this land. Every battle fought here, every drop of blood spilled has strengthened it, and now it is awake." Jacob leaned forward, his skepticism wavering. "Guardian of what? The forest? Why would it attack us?" The elder's gaze shifted to Jacob, his eyes dark and unreadable. "The land does not choose sides. It does not care for your wars, your flags, or your causes. It cares only for balance. And when balance is broken, the Skinwalker appears to restore it." Steve frowned, his mind racing. "Restore it how? By killing us?" The elder nodded gravely. "By feeding on the chaos you bring, it is drawn to bloodshed, to fear. Your battle has brought it here, and it will not leave until the balance is restored." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Steve looked around at his men, their faces pale and drawn. They weren't just fighting a war against the British anymore. They were fighting something far older, far deadlier, and far beyond their understanding. "What do we do?" Steve asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "How do we stop it?" The elder paused, his gaze fixed on the fire. "You cannot kill it," he said finally, "not with your weapons, but you can weaken it. The Skinwalker is tied to the fear and violence you bring. If you break that cycle, you may survive." "Break the cycle?" Jacob repeated, his frustration evident. "What does that even mean? We're in the middle of a war." The elder's gaze didn't waver. "It means you must fight differently. The creature feeds on fear. Do not give it what it wants. Stand together, protect each other, and remember, this is not just a battle for your lives, it is a battle for your souls." The fire crackled softly as the elder's words sank in. Steve felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had led his men through countless battles, but this was different. This wasn't a fight they could win with brute force or strategy. This was something deeper, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about war. As the elder stood to leave, he placed a small pouch in Steve's hand. "These symbols may offer you some protection," he said, "but they are not a solution. Only your actions will determine your fate." Steve looked down at the pouch, its contents rattling softly. He wanted to ask more questions, to demand answers, but the elder turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as silently as he had appeared. The soldiers around the fire shifted uncomfortably, their fear palpable. Jacob shook his head, his skepticism creeping back. "This is madness," he muttered. "We're supposed to fight a war, and now we're worrying about whatever that thing is." Steve's voice was firm as he replied, "It's not madness. You saw what happened to those men. You saw the claw marks, the eyes. This isn't something we can ignore, Jacob. We have to take it seriously." Jacob sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And what's the plan then? Use some symbols and hope for the best?" Steve met his gaze, his expression unyielding. "We stand together, we fight smart, and we don't let it break us." The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. The soldiers took turns keeping watch, their eyes constantly scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The growls had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. As dawn broke, The camp was bathed in a pale gray light. The forest, once shrouded in darkness, now seemed almost peaceful. But Steve knew better. The Skinwalker was still out there, watching, waiting, and it wouldn't stop until it had claimed what it came for. Steve gathered his men, their faces tired but resolute. He held up the pouch the elder had given him, showing them the symbols inside, carvings etched into small pieces of bone and stone. "These are supposed to protect us," he said. "Keep them close, but remember, this isn't just about these symbols. It's about how we face what's coming." The men nodded, their fear tempered by a growing sense of determination. Steve looked at Jacob, his closest ally in this fight. "We're going back into the forest," he said. "We need to figure out what we're dealing with, and this time we're going to be ready." Jacob hesitated, then nodded. "All right, Steve, let's finish this." With their weapons in hand and the symbols clutched tightly, the group prepared to face the unknown. The forest awaited, dark and foreboding, its secrets hidden in the shadows. But Steve felt a flicker of hope. They weren't just fighting to survive, they were fighting to reclaim the balance, to face the fear that had taken hold of them. And this time, they wouldn't back down. The forest was eerily quiet as the group ventured back into its depths. The morning light barely filtered through the dense canopy above, casting everything in muted shades of gray. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself resisted their presence. Steve led the way, his rifle steady in his hands, the pouch of protective symbols tied securely to his belt. Behind him, the soldiers moved in tense silence, their eyes darting at every shadow, every rustling leaf. The air grew colder the deeper they went. It wasn't the natural chill of the morning, it was something else, something unnatural that gnawed at their resolve. Steve glanced back at Jacob, whose jaw was set in a grim line. The others followed closely, their fear barely contained. No one spoke, but they all felt it. They were being watched. They reached the clearing again, the scene of their previous discovery. The scattered bones and bloodied fabric were still there, untouched. The sight made Steve's stomach churn, but he forced himself to focus. This wasn't just a hunt, it was a confrontation. They weren't going to let the Skinwalker dictate the terms anymore. "We spread out," Steve whispered, his voice firm but quiet. "Stay in pairs. Look for anything, tracks, signs, anything that might give us an idea of what we're dealing with, and stay close. If you see something, call out. Don't engage alone." The men nodded, splitting into pairs and fanning out around the clearing. Steve and Jacob stayed together, their boots crunching softly on the forest floor as they scanned the area. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant caw of a crow. Steve's eyes flicked to the ground, searching for tracks, while Jacob kept his rifle raised, his finger hovering near the trigger. After several minutes, Jacob stopped abruptly, crouching down to examine something in the dirt. "Steve," he called softly, waving him over. Steve knelt beside him, his eyes narrowing as he saw the marks. They were deep grooves in the earth, as though something massive had passed through, dragging its claws behind it. The tracks led deeper into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. "That's not an animal," Jacob muttered, his voice tight with unease. "It's too deliberate." Steve nodded. "It's leading us somewhere. Stay alert." They followed the tracks cautiously, their senses heightened. The forest grew darker, the trees pressing closer together, their branches tangled like skeletal arms. The air felt heavier with every step, and the faint sound of whispers began to echo around them. It wasn't clear where the whispers were coming from. There were no distinct voices, just an unsettling murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Do you hear that?" Jacob asked, his voice barely audible. Steve nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Stay close. It's trying to rattle us." As they pressed on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't words. It was more like a low chant, rhythmic and unsettling. Steve's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. Fear was what the creature wanted. He couldn't let it win. Suddenly, the chanting stopped, replaced by a guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Steve froze, his eyes scanning the trees ahead. The growl came again, louder this time, and the shadows began to shift. Then they saw it. The Skinwalker emerged from the darkness, its massive form partially hidden by the trees. Its eyes burned like coals, glowing with an unnatural light that seemed to pierce through the shadows. Its body was a grotesque blend of man and beast, its limbs too long, its movements too fluid. The air around it seemed to ripple, as though the creature distorted reality itself. "Don't move," Steve whispered, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Hold your ground." The creature stepped closer, its glowing eyes fixed on the group. It moved with an eerie grace, its claws dragging along the ground, leaving deep gouges in the earth. Steve's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. He tightened his grip on his rifle, his mind racing. This was the moment the Elder had warned them about. The Skinwalker was testing them, feeding on their fear. "Stand together," Steve said, his voice firm. "No one breaks formation." The soldiers closed ranks, their rifles trained on the creature. The protective symbols the Elder had given them seemed to hum with energy, a faint glow emanating from the carvings. The Skinwalker paused, its head tilting as if it sensed the power in the symbols. It let out a low, menacing growl, but it didn't advance. Steve took a deep breath, his voice steady. "We're not here to fight. We're here to end this." The creature's eyes narrowed, its movement slowing. It seemed to study them, its glowing gaze shifting from one soldier to the next. For a moment, the air was still, the tension unbearable. Then the Skinwalker let out a deafening roar, its form rippling as it disappeared into the shadows. The forest fell silent again, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. Steve exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing. He turned to Jacob, who was still gripping his rifle tightly. "It's not over," Steve said quietly, "but it knows we're not afraid." Jacob nodded, his face pale but resolute. "What now?" Steve glanced at the tracks leading deeper into the forest. "We keep going. It's not going to stop until we face it head on." The group regrouped, their fear replaced by a grim determination. They weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting to reclaim the balance the Skinwalker had spoken of. And they wouldn't stop until the creature was defeated. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the darker it became. The sunlight that had managed to pierce the canopy earlier was now completely swallowed by the tangled branches overhead. The soldiers moved in tense silence, their breaths visible in the increasingly cold air. Steve led the way, his rifle ready, the pouch of protective symbols clinking softly against his belt with each step. Behind him, Jacob and the rest of the group followed closely, their eyes scanning every shadow, every movement. The tracks they had been following grew more distinct, the gouges in the earth deeper and more deliberate. It was clear now. The creature wasn't just wandering. It was leading them somewhere. Steve's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he pushed the thought aside. Whatever this thing was, it wouldn't stop until it was confronted. Running would only delay the inevitable. They came upon a narrow path. The trees on either side twisted and gnarled, their roots clawing out of the ground like skeletal fingers. The whispers returned, faint but growing louder with each step. They seemed to come from the very trees, a low, rhythmic murmur that sent chills down their spines. "What is that sound?" one of the younger soldiers, Davis, asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Focus," Steve said firmly, not looking back. "Keep moving." The path opened up into a clearing, and the sight before them made the soldiers stop in their tracks. At the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its bark blackened and scarred as if it had been struck by lightning countless times. Around its base were crude carvings, symbols etched deep into the wood. The ground was littered with bones, some animal, some unmistakably human. Steve's stomach churned as he took in the scene. This wasn't just a lair. It was a place of power, a focal point for whatever dark force the creature embodied. The air was heavy with an almost suffocating energy, and the protective symbols in the pouch began to vibrate faintly as if reacting to the presence of the Skinwalker. "It's a trap," Jacob muttered, his grip tightening on his rifle. "We shouldn't be here." "We don't have a choice," Steve replied, his voice low but steady. "This is where it ends." The soldiers fanned out, forming a defensive circle around the clearing. Steve approached the tree cautiously, his eyes scanning the carvings. They were crude but deliberate, their shapes unfamiliar yet unsettling. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on him, as if the land itself was watching. A sudden growl broke the silence, low and menacing, coming from the shadows beyond the clearing. The soldiers froze, their rifles raised, their eyes darting toward the sound. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. "It's here," Steve said, his voice calm but firm. "Hold your ground." The shadows shifted, and the Skinwalker emerged, its massive form looming at the edge of the clearing. Its glowing eyes burned with a fierce, predatory light, and its body seemed to ripple as though it were both solid and smoke. The creature let out a deafening roar, its claws digging into the ground as it advanced slowly, deliberately. Steve raised his rifle, his heart pounding. "Stand together," he ordered. "Don't break formation." The soldiers held their ground, their weapons trained on the creature. The protective symbols around their necks and belts seemed to glow faintly, their energy creating a barrier that the Skinwalker hesitated to cross. But the creature wasn't deterred. It circled them, its movements fluid and unnatural, its growls deep and guttural. Steve could feel the fear radiating from his men, but he knew they couldn't give in. The elder's words echoed in his mind. The creature feeds on fear. Do not give it what it wants. "Stay calm," Steve said, his voice steady. "It's testing us." The Skinwalker stopped suddenly, its glowing eyes locking onto Steve. For a moment, the clearing was silent, the tension unbearable. Then, with a burst of speed that defied logic, the creature lunged. "Now!" Steve shouted. The soldiers fired, their rifles erupting in a deafening volley. The bullets hit the creature, but instead of piercing its flesh, they seemed to pass through it, the Skinwalker's form rippling like water. The protective symbols glowed brighter, their energy pushing the creature back, but it wasn't enough to stop it. The Skinwalker roared, its claws slashing through the air. One of the soldiers, Davis, was caught off guard, and the creature's swipe sent him flying into the trees. His scream was cut short, and the sound of snapping branches echoed through the clearing. Steve gritted his teeth, his mind racing. The symbols were working, but they weren't enough. The creature was too powerful, too relentless. He needed another plan, and fast. "Jacob," he shouted, "the symbols, use them!" Jacob hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He reached into his pouch and pulled out one of the carved stones, holding it up toward the creature. The stone glowed brightly, its light casting eerie shadows across the clearing. The Skinwalker recoiled, letting out a furious snarl, but it didn't retreat. Steve grabbed his own symbol and held it high. "Focus on the light," he called to his men. "It's the only thing that's hurting it." The soldiers followed his lead, pulling out their symbols and holding them toward the creature. The combined glow created a barrier of light, pushing the Skinwalker back step by step. Its growls turned into shrieks, its form flickering and distorting as if it were being torn apart. But the battle wasn't over. The Skinwalker let out one final deafening roar, its claws raking the ground as it disappeared into the shadows. Once again, the clearing fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting slightly, but Steve knew it wasn't gone. It was retreating, but it would be back. "We've weakened it," Steve said, his voice firm but weary. "But it's not over yet." The soldiers regrouped, their faces pale but determined. They had survived the encounter, but the fight was far from finished. The Skinwalker was still out there, waiting, watching, and Steve knew they had to be ready. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the soldiers regrouped at the edge of the clearing. Steve could feel the weight of exhaustion settling over them, but he knew they couldn't afford to rest. The Skinwalker wasn't gone. It was retreating, regrouping, and waiting for its next chance to strike. They had wounded it, but that only made it more dangerous. Jacob leaned against a tree, his breathing heavy. "It's not just a creature, Steve. It's something else. It doesn't fight like an animal. It fights like it's thinking." Steve nodded, his eyes scanning the shadows. "It is thinking, and it's watching us. It knows we're a threat now." The other soldiers stood in a tight circle, their rifles clutched tightly, their protective symbols glowing faintly against their chests. Davis was gone, his body lost in the chaos of the attack, and the weight of his absence hung heavy in the air. The men didn't speak of him, but their silence said everything. "We need to push deeper," Steve said, his voice steady despite the growing fear in his chest. "If we stay here, it'll pick us off one by one. We have to find its lair where it's strongest. That's the only way we can end this." Jacob frowned. "You want to go after it? Into its territory? That's suicide, Steve." "It's suicide if we don't," Steve replied firmly. "You saw what it did to Davis, to the others. It won't stop until we're all gone. We have to finish this." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them argued. They trusted Steve, even if they didn't understand the full extent of what they were up against. He was their leader, and they would follow him into the depths of hell, if that's what it took. The group moved deeper into the forest, the oppressive darkness growing thicker with each step. The protective symbols seemed to hum softly, their light cutting through the shadows, but the whispers returned, faint and haunting. They sounded closer now, more distinct, as if the forest itself was speaking to them. "What's that?" One of the soldiers, Harris, asked, his voice trembling. He pointed to a tree ahead, its bark covered in fresh carvings. The symbols were crude and jagged, but they pulsed faintly with an unnatural light. Steve approached the tree cautiously, his rifle raised. The carvings weren't just marks, they were warnings. The air around the tree was cold, unnaturally so, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the air. "It's marking its territory," Steve said, his voice low. "It wants us to know we're getting closer." Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle. "Closer to what? Its lair?" "Closer to the end," Steve replied, his tone grim. He turned back to the group. "Stay sharp. It's not going to let us get there without a fight." The soldiers pressed on, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and gnarled, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab them. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the faint growls that accompanied them sent chills down their spines. Suddenly, a low rumble shook the ground beneath their feet. The soldiers froze, their eyes darting around the forest. The rumble grew louder, followed by the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves. "It's coming," Steve said, his voice steady but urgent. "Get ready." The group formed a defensive circle, their rifles raised, their protective symbols glowing brighter. The air grew colder, the whispers turning into guttural growls that seemed to echo from every direction. Then the shadows began to shift. "It's marking its territory," Steve said, his voice low. "It wants us to know we're getting closer." Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle. "Closer to what? Its lair?" "Closer to the end," Steve replied, his tone grim. He turned back to the group. "Stay sharp. It's not going to let us get there without a fight." The soldiers pressed on, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and gnarled, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab them. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the faint growls that accompanied them sent chills down their spines. Suddenly, a low rumble shook the ground beneath their feet. The soldiers froze, their eyes darting around the forest. The rumble grew louder, followed by the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves. "It's coming," Steve said, his voice steady but urgent. "Get ready." The group formed a defensive circle, their rifles raised, their protective symbols glowing brighter. The air grew colder, the whispers turning into guttural growls that seemed to echo from every direction. Then the shadows began to shift. The Skinwalker emerged from the darkness, its massive form towering over the soldiers, its glowing eyes burned with rage, its claws glinting in the faint light. It moved with unnatural speed, circling the group, its growls deep and menacing. "Hold your ground," Steve shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The soldiers fired, their bullets whizzing through the air, but the creature moved too quickly, its form flickering like a phantom. It lunged, its claws slashing through the air, but the protective symbols repelled it, the light creating a barrier that pushed it back. "It's testing us," Jacob said, his voice tight with fear. "It's looking for a weakness." Steve gritted his teeth. "Then we don't give it one." The Skinwalker roared, its form rippling as it charged again. This time it struck with more force, its claws tearing through the ground as it tried to break through the barrier. The soldiers held their ground, their protective symbols glowing brighter, their determination unyielding. Steve's mind raced as he watched the creature's movements. It was intelligent, adapting to their tactics. But it wasn't invincible. The symbols were working, but they needed something more. Something to tip the scales in their favor. "Jacob," Steve said, his voice urgent. The elder said the land remembers. What if we use that against it? Jacob frowned, his eyes darting to the carvings on the trees. You mean the markings? You think they're connected? Steve nodded. They're tied to it somehow. If we can destroy them, maybe we can weaken it. Jacob hesitated, then nodded. It's worth a shot. Harris, cover us! Steve shouted as he and Jacob sprinted toward the nearest tree. The carvings pulsed with an unnatural light, their energy feeding into the Skinwalker. Steve raised his rifle, using the butt to smash the carvings. The light flickered and dimmed, and the Skinwalker let out a furious roar, its movements becoming more erratic. The soldiers fired again, their bullets finding their mark as the creature stumbled, its strength waning. It's working! Jacob shouted. Keep going! Steve and Jacob moved from tree to tree, destroying the carvings one by one. With each strike, the Skinwalker grew weaker, its form flickering like a dying flame. The soldiers pressed their advantage, their protective symbols glowing brighter as they closed in on the creature. But the battle wasn't over yet. The forest seemed to shudder as the last carving shattered beneath the butt of Steve's rifle. The glowing symbols on the tree faded into nothing, leaving behind only jagged scratches in the bark. The ground beneath them trembled slightly, and the oppressive cold that had wrapped around them began to lift. But the Skinwalker, though weakened, was far from defeated. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes flickering like dying embers. Its form was less solid now, its limbs shimmering and distorting as though it was struggling to maintain its shape. The guttural growls it emitted were laced with anger and desperation, its movements slower but still deliberate. The soldiers closed ranks, their weapons trained on the creature, their protective symbols glowing brighter than ever. Steve wiped the sweat from his brow, his breath visible in the cold air. It's hurt, but it's not finished. We need to end this now. Jacob glanced at him, his face pale but resolute. How? It's still too strong. Steve's mind raced as he scanned the clearing. The elder's words echoed in his mind. The land remembers your battles. It calls to them. The only way to end this is to bring balance. It wasn't enough to weaken the Skinwalker. They had to confront the root of its power, the chaos and bloodshed that had awakened it. There has to be something tying it to this place, Steve said, his voice firm. Something it's feeding on. Look for anything that doesn't belong. The soldiers spread out cautiously, their eyes scanning the ground and the surrounding trees. The Skinwalker watched them, its head tilting as though it understood what they were doing. It let out a low, rumbling growl, its claws scraping against the ground. Then Harris called out, his voice shaking, "Over here! I found something!" Steve and Jacob rushed to his side, their rifles at the ready. Harris was pointing to a small mound of earth near the base of a tree. The soil looked freshly disturbed, and faint wisps of smoke rose from it. Steve knelt down, his hand hovering over the ground. The heat emanating from it was unnatural, almost like the embers of a dying fire. "What is it?" Jacob asked, his voice tense. Steve didn't answer. He grabbed a nearby branch and began digging into the mound, the loose soil giving way easily. As he unearthed the object beneath, the temperature around them seemed to drop even further. Finally, he uncovered a charred, bloodied totem, a crude figure carved from wood, its surface blackened and stained. "It's a binding totem," Steve said, his voice low. "This is what's anchoring it here." The Skinwalker let out a deafening roar, its form flickering violently. It lunged toward them, its claws tearing through the air, but the protective symbols flared brightly, forcing it back. The creature shrieked in rage, its movements becoming more erratic. "What do we do with it?" Jacob shouted, his eyes darting between the totem and the advancing creature. Steve gritted his teeth. "We destroy it." He grabbed the totem, its surface burning hot to the touch, and held it aloft. The Skinwalker let out another piercing roar, its form surging forward as though to stop him. But the soldiers held their ground, their weapons firing in unison, forcing the creature to retreat. Steve slammed the totem against a nearby rock, the impact splintering the wood. The creature shrieked, its form rippling as though it was being torn apart. He struck it again, harder this time, and the totem cracked further, glowing faintly as the energy within it began to dissipate. "Keep going," Jacob urged, his voice filled with desperation. With one final swing, Steve shattered the totem completely. The glow vanished, and the shards of wood disintegrated into ash. The ground trembled violently, and the Skinwalker let out one last earth-shaking roar before its form imploded, collapsing into itself in a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, the clearing was silent. The oppressive cold was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost peaceful. The soldiers stood in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The Skinwalker was gone, its presence erased from the forest. Steve dropped to his knees, his chest heaving. His hands were raw and blistered from the heat of the totem, but he didn't care. It was over. They had done it. Jacob knelt beside him, his expression a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Is it gone?" Steve nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's gone." The soldiers regrouped, their exhaustion evident in their slumped shoulders and heavy steps. They had survived, but the cost was high. Davis and the others who had fallen would never return, their lives claimed by a force they couldn't have imagined. As they made their way back to camp, the forest seemed different. The oppressive shadows were gone, and the whispers had faded into silence. The land, once hostile and foreboding, now felt at peace. But Steve knew the scars would remain, not just on the land, but on them as well. The battle was over, but the memories would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As they reached the edge of the forest, Steve turned back one last time, his eyes scanning the trees. For a moment, he thought he saw a faint glow deep within the shadows, but it was gone in an instant, leaving only the quiet rustle of the leaves. "Let's go," Steve said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "It's done." The soldiers nodded, their steps slow but steady as they left the forest behind. The Skinwalker was defeated, but the truth of what they had faced would remain a secret, buried in the shadows of the past. As dawn broke over the forest, the soldiers emerged into the light, their faces pale and their uniforms torn and bloodied, the weight of the night pressed heavily on their shoulders. The sunlight felt foreign, almost intrusive, as if it didn't belong in a world where such horrors existed. They trudged toward their camp in silence, each man lost in his thoughts, their collective relief overshadowed by the memories that would haunt them forever. The camp was eerily still as they approached. Steve noticed the wary glances from the other soldiers as they entered, their presence stirring unease among the men who hadn't witnessed the horrors of the forest. Jacob leaned against a post, his exhaustion evident, while Harris dropped his gear and sat heavily on a crate, staring at the ground with hollow eyes. Steve gathered the remaining members of his squad near the fire pit, its embers barely glowing. He felt the eyes of the camp on them, curiosity and fear mingling in the air. But he didn't care. His focus was on his men, the few who had survived the nightmare. "We did what we had to do," Steve began, his voice low and steady. "But we lost too much. Davis, Carter, they deserved better." Jacob nodded, his jaw tight. "We couldn't save them, Steve. That thing, it was beyond anything we could have prepared for." Steve's gaze dropped to his hands, the blisters from the totem still raw and painful. "It wasn't just the Skinwalker," he said quietly. "It was us. The battles we fought, the blood we've spilled, we woke it up. The elder was right. The land remembers." The group fell silent, the weight of Steve's words sinking in. They had come to fight a war against an enemy they could see, a battle they could understand. But the forest had shown them that some battles were far older, far more complex than anything they could comprehend. A faint rustling drew Steve's attention to the edge of the camp. The elder stood there, his expression solemn, his eyes filled with something that looked like both relief and sorrow. He approached slowly, his steps measured, and the soldiers parted to let him through. "You survived," the elder said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "The land has found its balance for now." Steve stood, his back straight, despite the exhaustion pulling at him. "We destroyed the totem. The Skinwalker is gone." The elder nodded slowly. "You have weakened its presence, but the land will never forget. It will rest, but it will not forgive. Remember that the next time your battles bring you here." Steve met the elder's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. He didn't argue, didn't try to justify their actions. He simply nodded. "What do we do now?" Harris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Steve turned to his men, his expression firm but weary. "We move forward, we fight the battles we have to fight, but we remember what we've seen here, what we've done, and we don't forget the cost." The elder placed a hand on Steve's shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. "You carry the weight of this night, Sergeant. Let it guide you, but do not let it consume you." Steve nodded again, his throat tight. The elder turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees without another word. The camp was silent, the soldiers watching Steve as if waiting for some final command, some reassurance that they could leave the horrors behind. "Get some rest," Steve said finally, his voice heavy. "We've got a long fight ahead." The men dispersed, their movements slow and deliberate. Steve remained by the fire, staring into the dying embers. He thought of Davis, of Carter, of the others who had been taken by the Skinwalker. He thought of the glowing eyes, the flickering form, the inhuman growls that would haunt his dreams. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, the camp began to stir, the routines of war resuming as if the night had been nothing more than a bad dream. But Steve knew better. He knew the scars would remain, etched into the land, into their minds, into their souls. The Skinwalker was gone, but its presence lingered, a shadow that would never fully lift. And Steve knew that the land, though quiet now, would always remember. He stood, his body aching, and walked toward his tent. The weight of the night hung. He stood, his body aching, and walked toward his tent. The weight of the night hung heavy on him, but he carried it with the resolve of a soldier who had faced the impossible and survived. For now, that was enough.